Welcome back to the Strategy Show. My name is Ben, and today we're jumping into a topic that, well, it feels on the surface, it feels incredibly straightforward. It's the one thing every business owner, every shareholder, and every CEO is completely obsessed with: growth. I mean, if a company isn't growing, the market generally assumes it's dying. It's that simple. However, as always, there's a bit more to it than that. I think for most of us, growth just means sell more stuff. Just push more products, hire more salespeople, buy more ads, whatever. But actually, that's only part of the overall picture. Selling more is just the outcome of successful growth. The real story, and the one we're going to look at, is about the structural choices you make to actually get that growth in the first place. Now, growth is really about a business making a fundamental decision about its anatomy. Do you build extra limbs yourself? Do you go out and buy another body and stitch it to yours? Or do you just rent someone else's muscles for a while? Which is perhaps a slightly gory and terrifying analogy, but it's pretty accurate. In today's episode, we're going to explore three distinct methods of growth. First, the classic fork in the road: organic growth versus acquisition, the build it or buy it dilemma. Often the first and honestly the hardest decision a board has to make. Then we're going to look at what happens when companies decide to get hitched, so joint ventures. And finally, the model that dominates the high street, which is franchising. Now, it's important we don't just hype up growth. There are real headaches involved in every path you might take to expanding your organization. And before we go any further, this is a key takeaway here: that there is no correct path. Each one is a massive trade-off, mainly between speed, control, and capital. So let's start with that first big decision. You're running a company, you want to get bigger. The most basic option on the table is organic growth. This is quite simply growth through internal projects. This is the non-acquisition or do-it-yourself route. This is you opening a new branch. This is you expanding your factory. This is your R&D team inventing an entirely new product line from scratch. There are lots of pros for this method. It allows you to go at your own pace. It's easier to finance. But the one that really stands out to me, and that actually often gets overlooked, is innovation. Organic growth allows for actual innovation, like new store designs and new products. Think about it. If you build organically, you are building for the future. You have a clean slate. You can design your warehouse for modern robotics. You can wire your store for the most up-to-date technology. You aren't inheriting someone else's legacy mass. If you acquire another company, you're inheriting the ghosts of the past. You get their ugly carpets, their outdated IT systems that run on Windows 95, their bad management habits. Organic growth avoids all that baggage because you're building exactly what you need. And strictly speaking, organic growth is often cheaper, as we aren't having to pay to buy someone else's brand name. Now, that last one is a very important financial point. When you buy a company, you aren't just paying for the trucks and the buildings, the tangible assets. You're paying a premium for the goodwill, the brand value, which can be huge amounts of money if it's a successful company. It's an extreme example. I'm not suggesting you're going to go out and do this, but if you were to buy the brand name Apple, just the brand on its own, it would be worth over $600 billion. And that's without any of their tangible assets. With organic growth, you're just paying for the physical assets that you need for the expansion. You aren't paying a premium for a reputation that you're going to have to build anyway. So if it's cheaper, cleaner, and you keep total control, why doesn't everyone just grow organically? Why is the mergers and acquisitions market a $1 trillion industry every year? Well, it's often because of one of the main drawbacks of organic growth, which is barriers to entry. It sounds mundane, but it is the killer. Let's say you want to be a major supermarket player. You can't just build 500 stores next year. You have to find 500 locations. You have to fight for planning permission in 500 towns. You have to build supply chains from scratch and hire all the staff. It's excruciatingly slow. And in business, time's money. If the market's moving fast, organic growth might be way too slow for you to keep up. By the time you build your network, the opportunity might be completely gone and another rival might have filled the gap in the market you're after. Which brings us to acquisition as an alternative, the strategy for the impatient or the ambitious. The definition here is simple: buying or merging with another organization. Now, as we mentioned already, this is a much faster way to expand your operations, but there are some other, rather more aggressive benefits to an acquisition. Firstly, it could be used to eliminate a rival. It's the Pac-Man strategy. You aren't just getting bigger, you're removing a competitor from the board. For example, let's think about the UK supermarket chain Morrisons. It could consider growth through acquisition of a rival supermarket chain like Sainsbury's. Now, that would be a titanic shift in the market, but think about why it could be a success. It's not just to get bigger revenue numbers. One of the big benefits is the idea of rapid access to synergies and economies of scale. Now, I always feel like synergy is one of those bingo words that executives use to justify their bonuses. But in this case, it may be a big factor in deciding to undertake an acquisition. As a bigger merged company, you can streamline your operations, which is, I suppose, a kind way of saying you can eliminate duplication of functions and operations, which very often means getting rid of employees that are no longer needed and saving their wages. You also have more negotiating power with your suppliers because you buy more product, meaning you can achieve lower purchase prices. That can be absolutely crucial in the supermarket industry, which has razor thin profit margins. Acquisition is also the direct answer to the barriers to entry problem we just talked about. If Morrisons buy Sainsbury's, they don't have to spend 10 years finding local sites. They instantly own hundreds of them. They instantly have delivery trucks, the warehouses, supplier contracts, that they smash through that barrier to entry overnight. So you're essentially buying speed and market dominance. Now, of course, you could also buy a company that isn't a rival. Morrisons could buy a complementary company like a food wholesaler in order to strengthen its market position. Or it could buy a company in a different industry completely, like a clothing retailer. Now, these may not lead to much in the way of synergies, but they would be a great way to diversify Morrison's risk by growing its operations into new sectors beyond the very saturated and risky UK supermarket industry. It's worth also noting that why ever you decided to acquire another company, a merged larger company reduces risk for investors. Theoretically, the bigger you are, the harder it is for market fluctuations to knock you over. You become too big to fail. This makes it easier to raise finance, both debt and equity, again making acquisition a very attractive option. But, and there is a very big but indeed, there is a cost to acquisition. And the cost is, well, it's actually the literal cost. That's the liquidity trap. Organic growth can be funded out of your yearly profits. You make money, you build a new store. Acquisition requires a massive pile of cash up front. You're leveraging the future of the company to buy growth today. And as we mentioned earlier, if we're buying a successful target company, we'll also be paying a premium to acquire their brand. Risk within acquisition isn't just financial though, there's a huge risk of failure if the cultures don't mesh. We've seen this in the real world a million times. Company A buys Company B, they promise synergies, but Company A is formal and suit wearing, and Company B is casual and remote first. The employees hate each other, the integration fails, and you've just spent billions to buy a headache. One of the classic examples of this is AOL's doomed acquisition of Time Warner back in 2002. The two companies, one an internet provider and the other entertainment content producer, should have been able to work together to create entertainment programming and distribute it to customers online. However, there were huge cultural clashes between the organizations, and their operations and management teams just failed to successfully merge. In the end, AOL lost around 100 billion of value in write-downs due to the acquisition, money lost directly from the shareholders, and the companies essentially demerged in 2009. So that's the first area. In a nutshell, organic is safe but slow, acquisition is fast but expensive and risky. Now, let's move to the second area we could consider as a method of growth. This is for when you want to grow, but maybe you can't afford to buy a rival and you can't wait to build it yourself. This brings us to joint ventures or JVs. Essentially, what if we grow and develop our business by linking to other organizations? That's the core of a JV. Now, it's important to define this. A joint venture is not just a partnership or a handshake deal. This is where a company is formed in which two or more businesses take an equity stake. The equity stake is what makes it essentially a marriage between two businesses. You're creating a third entity, a business baby, if you will, and you're both putting actual capital on the table. Now, we tend to assume partnerships are equally owned by each parent, but in reality, the ownership of joint ventures can be any percentage at all. I mean, in reality, 50-50 ownership between two parent companies sounds nice, but in business, it often leads to deadlock. If we disagree, nothing happens in the joint venture. A say, 58-42 split tells me one partner demanded control. They said, look, we'll do this together, but I'm driving the car. I've got the most say in what happens in this joint venture. So who's actually doing this in the real world? The answer is lots of heavy hitters. We've got, for example, Uber paired with Volvo. Actually, the Uber and Volvo joint venture example is perfect for explaining why people do joint ventures. The driver behind this was the sharing of skills for the launch of autonomous self-driving vehicles. Think about it. Uber is a software company. They know how to map routes and connect riders. Volvo is a manufacturer. They know how to bend metal and make safe cars. Uber doesn't want to build car factories. That is a capital nightmare. And Volvo probably doesn't want to try and code a ride-hailing algorithm from scratch. So the two companies have complementary deficits. By forming a JV, they can develop autonomous driving tech together. They share large initial investments. Neither of them wants to burn billions on R&D alone, so they split the bill. JVs can also be really important for the global angle, as it may be that JVs allow for access to certain markets. Many countries, such as China and India, have historically had regulations requiring a JV as an access requirement for their local markets. And even the European Union has been considering similar approaches. If a Western company like BMW wanted to manufacture and sell cars inside China, they were legally required to form a joint venture with a local company. It was the price of admission. You want access to 1.4 billion consumers? Well, you have to partner with a local firm. BMW brings the engineering prestige, a local partner company brings the regulatory access and local market knowledge. So joint ventures sound like the perfect solution. You share the cost, you share the skills, you get access to locked markets. But you do need to consider the issues with this approach as well. Sharing of profits can sting. If the venture becomes the next big thing, so if you invent the perfect self-driving car, you only get 50% or so of the profit. You don't own the win. But even more worrying can be the sharing of sensitive information, because it could end up with you giving up competitive advantage. And this is the nightmare scenario, really. It's something that we sometimes call a learning race. You enter a JV with a partner, you teach them your manufacturing skills, your quality control, your code. 5 years later, the partnership dissolves. Now you haven't just lost a partner, you've created a competitor who knows all your skills. In some cases, you essentially trained your assassin. Plus, as with an acquisition, we can have cultural and operational differences. I mean, imagine the culture clash between a Silicon Valley tech giant like Uber, which is all about moving fast and breaking things, and a Swedish safety-obsessed manufacturer like Volvo. Those meetings could be incredibly tense. So joint ventures are powerful for sharing risk, but they come with massive trust issues. And that leads us to the final approach we're going to look at in this episode. And this one is the most visible, I think, to us as consumers. McDonald's, Costa Coffee, KFC, Subway. The list is almost endless of companies that use this final approach. And that final approach is franchising. Now, the definition here is a business model where a company, the franchisor, grants another party, the franchisee, the right to operate a business using its brand, products, services, and operational methods. Or if you want to put it a bit more cynically, it's growth using other people's money. From the perspective of the brand owner, so McDonald's or KFC, it's a brilliant financial win. If McDonald's corporate wants to open a new location in a town, they don't have to pay to lease or fit out the new store. They don't have to interview people to flip the burgers. The franchisee, the local operator, does all of that. And the franchisee takes the financial risk. They put up the capital. And in return, the franchisor, so McDonald's, gets an ongoing share of the profits, royalties. So basically, as a franchisor, I let you use my sign and you send me a check every month for the privilege. Now, this explains why these chains explode in size so quickly. You can open 1,000 stores in a year because you aren't the one paying for them. It's a replication machine, but it's not without peril. The biggest risk for the franchisor is loss of day-to-day control, and that can lead to really significant reputational issues. And I think this is really the ultimate vulnerability of the franchise model. If I go to a KFC and the chicken's cold and the staff are rude, I don't think, oh, Dave, the local franchisee is having a bad day. I think, well, KFC, it's terrible. So brand is shared. One bad apple in your franchisees really spoils the bunch. Which means the franchisor has need for expensive oversight. You have to hire armies of inspectors, mystery shoppers, and regional managers to police your own partners. You're constantly fighting to maintain consistency. Now, let's kind of flip the view on this one. Why would anyone agree to be a franchisee? Essentially, because it's buying a business in a box. If you want to start a burger joint, the failure rate for an independent burger shop is incredibly high. But if you open a McDonald's, you have a menu that is proven, you have a supply chain that's ready, set up, and delivers, you've got a brand name, and you've got national advertising that you don't have to pay for by yourself. So it is significantly safer. But the downsides for the franchisee seem psychological as much as financial. There's a loss of control and innovation, and that's kind of the core trade-off. If you're a creative entrepreneur who wants to invent a new spicy sauce or change your opening hours or paint the walls blue, you can't. You're buying a rule book. You have to follow the established guidelines. You are essentially a manager who has taken on the financial risk of an owner. And of course, you have to share profits. You take out the loans to set up the store, you do the work, you sweat over the grill, and you still send a percentage of your sales to corporate headquarters. So it really is a fascinating spectrum when you look at all three together. It seems like a sliding scale of control versus capital. In this episode, we've looked at lots of different ways to grow. Let's try and pull this all together by looking at the whole menu, as it were. So, organic growth. This is high control, high retention of profit, but low speed. You keep the gold, but it takes a lifetime to mine it. Then we have acquisition. This is high speed, high market power, but high financial risk. You get big instantly, but you need a massive war chest of cash, and you risk indigestion from eating a competitor. Then joint ventures, shared speed, shared risk. It's the only way to tackle massive projects or locked markets, but you risk your trade secrets and you have to split the rewards. And finally, franchising. Maximum speed, minimum capital risk for the owner, but you are completely outsourcing your reputation to strangers, which is a terrifying thought when you really consider how fragile a brand reputation is today. Looking at this topic as a whole, it makes you wonder where we're going next. The lines seem to be blurring. We're seeing a shift in the modern economy that goes way beyond these traditional, classic styles of growth. In a world where technology moves so fast, I think we're going to see fewer massive clunky acquisitions and more of these loose, flexible networks. Think about location finding software and technology. You don't need to own the mapping software, you just connect to Google Maps. You don't need to own a payment processor, you connect to Stripe. So the question becomes, does a company need to own its supply chain or own its distribution? And that's quite an interesting thought. Maybe the future belongs to the connectors rather than the builders. If you can link the best manufacturer, the best logistics network, and the best brand together, do you actually need to own any of the assets? Or is the value just in the network itself? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode. I hope you found it useful and hopefully interesting. If you've been listening, please remember to follow the channel so you get notified of any future episodes as they drop. See you next time.